Hi, this is Vidya Heisel from Frog Lotus Yoga International, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about being a good yoga teacher today and what that might entail, what it might look like, and some thoughts and tips. So I have another section on how the skillful use of language. So I suggest you also watch the skillful use of language. This section is just some general things about teaching. So I have my own way of teaching. So some teachers tell you only teach verbally. Some schools of yoga, they're going to tell you only teach verbally, walk around, give assists, and teach verbally, which is fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong in doing that. But I mean, for me, there are several challenges with that, and I'd like to explain why I don't do that. So the way that I teach is to model on your mat at least half of the time, if not 3/4 of the time, and then also get off your mat and go give physical assists. I'm not a big fan of teaching verbally unless you're getting out of breath. So if you're getting out of breath whilst teaching, then I would get off the mat and walk around and teach verbally. But the reason that I suggest that you don't do the whole class like that is several reasons. The biggest reason for me is that a lot of people are visual learners. So they want to see the pose. So, and even when you're cueing well, which I hope you will be, it's much easier for some people just to see the pose visually. I know that for myself. I'm a visual learner. So I can sort of space out with verbal instructions, but when I look at somebody and I see what they're doing, then I can easily follow them. So that's one good reason to be modeling the poses. And the other reason is if you want to, especially if you're doing a slightly more challenging class and you're planning on demonstrating anything in the class, it's important that you are also warmed up to do what you are planning to do. So for example, you might be teaching a more intermediate back bend class, or you should never demonstrate an intermediate back bend without warming your own body in the way that you've been asking the students to warm up. I know a lot of teachers who've hurt themselves, including myself a few times, trying to do a posture without warming up enough. So it's another reason that you should be doing some of the practice on your mat. Now, obviously, when you're doing that, you need to be observing the students. And if somebody needs some physical help, then you should be able to go off your mat and help them. But what I find works well, a lot of the time, is verbal cueing. So that means I'm watching the students as I'm doing the postures, and I notice what they're maybe doing incorrectly or what needs some tweaking. And so I'll just cue. I'll give a cue that is general. And often you'll see the student that is doing the pose a little correctly correcting the pose because you've cued something. For example, maybe they're in Warrior 2. And maybe their knee is forward of their heel, their front knee, their bent knee. And then you would just give a cue like the knee should be directly over the heel. And then they're going to hear that cue and adjust themselves. So I think verbal cueing based on what you're seeing is a really nice way to teach, just to constantly be scanning the room and your cues are based on what you're seeing. And when you do get up and walk around, I have another suggestion. Because when you're giving an assist, sometimes you neglect everybody else in the room, and you don't want to do that. I've been in classes where you're in a posture, the teacher's giving an assist, and she just leaves you in that posture without saying anything for like several minutes. And so you feel kind of abandoned by the teacher whilst they're helping this other student. So what you want to so what you should do when you're giving an assist, and what I find works really well, is to verbally say out loud what you're doing to the student. So maybe you're rotating their rib cage up towards the ceiling. So you're going to actually say that as you do that with that student. Maybe you are, in down dog and you're rotating the upper arms outwards for one of your students, and you're actually doing that. But you can then give that out loud as a cue whilst doing it. And that's also great for the person that you're giving the assist to, because they can also feel you doing that with their body. So, but you're also keeping a connection with the other students, and you're not confusing yourself by saying something that you're not actually doing. So I think that's a great way of not abandoning the class when you're assisting. And I think not over-assisting. I think it's really important, especially if you have new students, that you don't assist their every pose and make them feel like they're the sort of dunce in the class because you're constantly giving them an assist. So I think especially when you have newer students that maybe are just finding their way, that you give them some space. And usually you'll find in a few classes that they slowly improve their alignment and the way they're doing things. And again, that's where verbal cueing can be really helpful. Sometimes if someone's really struggling with a pose, I might go over to them and do it beside them, facing the same direction as they are, so they can get a sense of what that should look like. I'm not a fan of mirroring. I know some schools of yoga teach mirroring. So if you're saying step the right foot forwards, you should step your left foot forwards. Okay, most people have real problems with left and right, even when they're doing the same side. So if you have to mirror the class, that's going to be extremely challenging, and it's going to be quite distracting, I think. I mean, maybe there's some people that can do that easily, but I would say the average person has difficulty with mirroring, because the average person has difficulty remembering right and left even when they're doing the same side. So I wouldn't worry about it. Traditionally in India, they've never taught mirroring. It's something which came in, I think, from the fitness industry or something. Another thing that might have come from the fitness industry in the West is teaching in a studio with mirrors. That's also a Bikram thing, I think. But I'm really not in favor of teaching in a studio with mirrors. You don't want people looking at themselves, judging themselves. Of course you can maybe check if your alignment's perfect, but most people are looking at themselves thinking they're too fat, they're not good enough, this kind of thing. And also yoga is not about how you look. Yoga, you're trying to encourage your students to turn inwards and to feel the postures from the inside out. So I also don't recommend teaching with mirrors. Another thing that I prefer is if you set up your mat facing the class. So you're facing the same direction, or you're facing the opposite direction of the students. You're looking at them, but your mat's in the same kind of alignment as the students' mats. Meaning you're not teaching sideways. Now, I understand that in some studios in cities, like in London, I've seen teachers set their mats up sideways, but there's literally no space for them to do anything else. So if that's the case, then you don't have an option. But the reason that I don't like that is because, I know the reason for doing it is meant to be that if you're demoing something, the students can see more easily if you're sideways. But I think that the cons outweigh the pro in that respect. Meaning that when you turn sideways to the class, first of all, your voice is projecting out to the side. You're not projecting towards the students. And secondly, there's a bit of a disconnect because you're not looking at the students, so you're looking off to the side. And I think that when you're teaching, you want to be able to see your students. So you want to be looking at them all the time, just scanning the room, making sure that nobody's going to do anything injurious, and that you feel this connection. So when you teach sideways, you lose that connection. So I think the advantage of teaching sideways is not strong enough to warrant doing that, unless you absolutely have to because there's no space. Another tip is I really don't like when teachers ask at the beginning of class, has anyone got an injury they want to tell me about? So I think, what if you were, I think for most people, they don't want to announce to a room full of strangers what injuries they're working with. Some people might be fine with that. But there are people that are a bit more private and also maybe a bit shy. So they're not going to start talking about various injuries that they have in front of the whole class. Another thing you need to know is if someone's pregnant or not. So it's not, again, something you don't want to ask the whole class. So what I suggest is that you try to meet people as they arrive. And my experience teaching in studios is that you tend to have regular students that you know, and you know about their injuries, and they come every class. So there's a whole bunch of students that you already know their injuries. And then you may get, a handful of new students. So you always make sure that you meet and greet those new students. That means you have to be there before the class, at least 15 minutes before, to meet and greet new students and to ask them about their injuries in private between you and them. So I think this is really important that you keep that conversation between the two of you. And then it's also important to mention that, I know these days, because we're during times of COVID right now, that we are probably not giving assists anyway, or we're not legally supposed to be giving assists anyway. But in better days, when we are allowed to give assists, I would suggest that you can use these cards. I've seen these cards. We have some in my studio here. And it's a little card that says, I would like to get assisted today. And on the other side it says, I will prefer not to get assisted today. And so people can just put this card at the top of their mat, and so you know whether or not they're comfortable with getting assists. Also, I'm going to do another video on the art of assisting because it's quite a big topic. So I'll maybe leave that for now. But some other tips also would be this thing of just being there for your students. And once you know they have an injury, then helping them, asking them about it, maybe giving them some tips for how to work with it or how to strengthen the injury. So I always would try to have a little time for the students after class as well, to check in with them, or if somebody wants to ask a question, to spend a little bit of time helping them with something. I've also been to classes where I've seen the teacher just showing off in front of the class, like before the class starts, like just doing their own practice and, coming into handstands and that kind of thing in front of the class. And I always feel like that's really uncool. So just being there and welcoming the students and greeting them when they arrive and just checking in with them is a really lovely thing to do when you're teaching. And I would recommend not just being disconnected from them as they arrive in the studio. Make sure that you do arrive on time when you're teaching. It's always important that you're there to set the room up, to light the candles, to put the heat on, to set your music up, set your mat up, so that you're ready when students come in and you're not running in at the last moment, kind of panicked. So I hope those were all helpful tips for your teaching. Thank you. Namaste.